Do you remember studying about World War II? And do you know what a cannibal is? Hi kids, this is Auntie Mila. I'm so glad you came by. I have a story for you. It's a story from World War II. Our verse today is Psalm 59:1, and it says, "Rescue me from my enemies, O God. Protect me from those who have come to destroy me." That's a prayer, and it's like a frantic prayer. Lord, help! That's what it's saying. David wrote that because he had lots of problems. There are people after him, and he had to run for his life. And so he would say that, "Rescue me, Lord, from my enemies." The sound was so small you could hardly hear it. But the flight engineer heard it, and he was thinking and thinking, and he looked over at the pilot and then the co-pilot, and they were just kind of dozing. The pilot had it on autopilot. The plane was flying itself. It was a big bomber. They were flying over the Pacific Ocean to the South Sea Islands, and the flight engineer was concerned about that noise, but he thought, well, I don't know what that could be. And he kept going on. The plane was flying along over the Pacific Ocean. You know, the Pacific Ocean is a big ocean. And there was no land in sight. All of a sudden, he heard the noise again. And this time the pilot woke up and he heard it, and he looked right at the flight engineer, and the flight engineer looked right at the pilot, and their eyes met. And they were exchanging thoughts without saying anything. And then by this time the co-pilot was awake, and they were listening. And do you know what happened? The red light came on, and so the co-pilot was trying to push buttons, trying to figure out what was wrong. And the flight engineer was going over his list. He was trying to check everything. One engine quit. There were 4 engines on the plane, on this big bomber. And so the pilot had to just feather that engine. And then, all of a sudden, there was another noise. And they thought, well, they could fly on 3 engines. But there was another noise, and another noise, and another engine went out. And the pilot had to feather that engine. And there were only 2 engines left. And they were going along. They were getting quite afraid now. And they were looking down, and they couldn't see any land. They couldn't see any islands, but they knew straight ahead were islands, the South Sea Islands, long time ago. And they knew there were cannibals there. Cannibals are people that kill people and eat people, if you can believe it. And they were flying along. All of a sudden, another engine went out. And they knew they were going to have to ditch the plane. That means just get out of the plane. So the pilot got on the radio and told the guys in the back, get ready to ditch the plane. But he didn't have to, because they already knew what was happening. They saw one engine after another quitting. And so the pilot came down. He thought, I'll try and land on the water, and maybe if we float for a little bit, we can get out of the plane before the plane goes into the water. And so they all got ready and braced themselves, and the pilot came down, and he landed on the water. And it was a real good landing. But it was water. It wasn't land. And so the plane just sat there on the water for a while. And they opened the door, and they got out their life raft, and they blew up their life raft, and they put it out, and they started throwing in rations. That means food and water, and they didn't know what they needed. There were 8 men on the plane. And so then they all got out into the life raft, and they had little paddles, and they were paddling like everything. They wanted to get away from the plane before the plane went down, because when the plane went down into the water, it would suck everything down with it. sucked down. So they were paddling away from the plane. They got way away from the plane, and they watched, and the plane just went right in the water. And then it was quiet. There they were, 8 men in a raft on the Pacific Ocean. And so the navigator, they were talking to him, they said, well, how far is land? He said, the closest island is 100 miles away. And they said, which direction? He said, the direction we were going, that way. They said, well, we better start paddling. So we started paddling and paddling and paddling. Can you imagine? Then they rigged up a sail, put up a stick with some fabric on it, and they were trying to get the wind so the wind could grab the sail and push them along. But mostly, they couldn't go in the direction they wanted. They just went the direction the wind was blowing. If the wind was blowing this way, they went this way, and they were kind of out there. So then they got to talking. And Mac was the engineer, and he says, well, if the enemy doesn't find us, the cannibals will, and they'll eat us and roast us and have a big fire, and they'll have a good dinner. And the pilot said, well, you know, there have been missionaries on these islands, and maybe they've converted them, and maybe they're Christian. Ah, big chance. Missionaries can't turn cannibals into Christians. I don't know what you're talking about. They had lots of time to talk. And they got thirsty. They had a little food. They would dole out the food, and they sailed day after day after day on the water. And you know, the sad part about that is there's water all around, but you can't drink it. You can't drink the ocean water. It just makes you more thirsty. And so they couldn't drink the ocean water. They had a little bit of water, and they doled it out. And then it got dark, and a night came, and then the next day, and then they would see sharks circling around their lifeboat. The shark was saying, I wonder how long they can last. I think this looks like a good dinner. And they kept sailing, but after about 4 days, they woke up one morning and said, land! And the navigator said, yeah, that's the island that we were going to be heading to. They were going to fly over that island. That's the island I was looking for. And so they started paddling faster and faster and faster. They thought, oh, we just need to get to that land. Well, it took them a long time, even though they saw land. It took them a long time to get to that island, and they got there at night. And they said, now, we know that the enemy has taken over this island, and they're cannibals, so we've got to be real quiet. And so they came up to the shore, and they got out. They were so happy to be on land. And they pulled their raft up, and then they got their few little possessions, and they started up through the jungle. And they just stopped someplace and had a night, slept. The next morning they thought, where are we? What are we going to do for food? And they were looking around, and so they made their little camp there at the edge of the island. Well, that evening, Mac heard something in the bushes. And then he looked and he saw a light, a bright light. He thought, oh, the enemy has found us. And the pilot saw it too. And they said, oh, it's the enemy. And someone else said, or the cannibals. And then they looked and they could see a native man. And he saw them, and then all of a sudden he disappeared. He thought, oh, that's the end of our life, because he is going to go and tell the enemy where we are, or he's going to tell the cannibals. We lose either way. We're going to die. These 8 men. And they sat there and they thought, what are we going to do? About an hour later, here came a whole row of native people. And one of the guys had a pistol, and he grabbed the pistol, and the pilot said, no fire, put that away. Look, they're not armed. Oh. And so he put his gun away. And they looked, and here came all of the natives in a long line. And one native walked up to the pilot and said, here, I have a gift for you. Do you know what he handed him? It was a black book. Can you guess? It was a Bible. And he handed him a Bible. And the pilot said, oh, thank you very much. And they said, we're Christians, and we have brought you food. They said, you did? You brought us food? Yes, and we brought you drink. We brought you water and drink. And they passed out the food, and all the 8 men ate. And they were so thankful for that food, and they drank. Oh, it was so good. They had coconut milk to drink from coconuts. And then afterwards, the main man of the natives, he picked up his Bible. He says, now, I want to read to you. And he picked up his Bible, and he started reading. And he read and read and read, and all the men sat there. They weren't going to complain. Only 1 or 2 were Christians. The others were not Christians at all. And they listened. And this man read and read in the Bible. And then he started singing, and all the natives started singing a Christian song. And some of the men thought, I know the tune of that song. I know. We used to sing that at our church back home. And they sang a Christian song, and then they sang another song, and they were so happy. They were such nice people. And after song after song, and after reading scriptures, then they had prayer. They said, we want to pray for you. And they knelt down and they prayed such a nice prayer that God would protect them and take care of these American soldiers. And then they got up and they says, good night, and they disappeared into the dark jungle. And the men sat there and they thought, this is incredible. And then the pilot looked over at Mac. He was the engineer, and said, do you think missionaries have been to this island? And Mac said, probably. How else would they know about Jesus? Well, they wondered if they'd ever see those nice people again. But you know what? The next evening, here they came, a long line of natives carrying food and drink, coconut milk and water and all kinds of good food. They came and they passed it out to everyone. And everyone ate. Oh, thank you, thank you, thank you. And then after they ate, do you know what they did? Oh, yeah. The chief picked up his Bible and he says, now I want to read here. And he started reading and reading and reading and reading and reading. After a long reading, and the men just sat there, very quiet. They were going to listen because these people were being so nice to them. They weren't going to be rude and say, no, we don't want to listen to the Bible. They just listened. And they had a worship just like the night before. And then the natives sang songs. They sang and sang and sang. And then they had prayer, and then they left. Disappeared into the dark jungle. Every night they came for 78 days. Every night they came. And you know what? They told them, yes, the enemy is camping on the other side of the island. But we don't tell the enemy that you're here. It's a secret, and they didn't. The whole 78 days they were there, they didn't tell the enemy at all that they were there. They didn't tell the enemy that they were feeding them. And they took good care of them for the 78 days. So finally the natives said, we will help you build a raft. So they did. They chopped down trees and they worked hard. The 8 airmen and the natives, they all worked together and they worked. They said, we know how to make a raft. So they made a really nice raft. It was really big and nice and had sides on it. And they said, now, when it gets dark, we'll feed you and give you some food and push you out. And the closest next island is right that direction. And maybe some Americans will come by, and American planes will see you and rescue you. They said, okay, thank you. So that's what they did. They put the airmen on the big raft that they had made, and they said, God bless you. We want to have prayer with you before you go. So the natives had a prayer, a very sincere prayer for them, and they pushed them off quietly at night so the enemy on the other side of the island wouldn't hear them. They were there, like I said, for 78 days, and they never told the enemy. It was a secret. The enemy never knew they were there, living on the same island with the enemy. This was during World War II. And they pushed them out, and a few days later, an American plane flying over saw them and rescued them. And they flew them back to America. And Mac was in the hospital. They were taking care of all the men. And you know what he said to the news? Your plane went down in the Pacific? They said, yes, our plane went down. And the natives were missionaries to us. They were Christians, and they took care of us. They saved our lives. And he said, I feel really indebted to the missionaries that went there and converted them. Yes, that's what he told the newspaper. They were so happy to be back in America. Isn't that a sweet story? I want to pray. Dear Lord Jesus, thank you for rescuing these airmen that went down the Pacific. Thank you for the natives that took good care of them. Lord, thank you for taking care of us too. We love you for Jesus' sake. Amen. Thank you so much for coming by. I have some more stories for you.